Now, the other big news story of the day is that Vladimir Putin is heading to China for talks with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The Russian president's trip comes less than a week after US President Donald Trump wrapped up his own visit to Beijing. Going into the talks, Russia is saying that it's got high expectations for the trip. Moscow and Beijing are working to deepen what the Kremlin describes as a privileged partnership. This is what the Russian president had to say earlier about the nature of the ties between the two countries.
Their special nature is reflected in the atmosphere of mutual understanding and trust, a commitment to pursuing win-win and equitable cooperation, conducting respectful dialogue, and supporting each other on matters affecting the core interests of both countries, including protection of sovereignty and state unity.
Joining me in the studio is Philip Turle, our International Affairs Editor. Philip, the two men's ties have very much deepened since Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 2022. Now, Putin has been visiting Beijing every year since then, especially given that his country's been effectively made or diplomatically cut off on the world stage. But how much of this partnership is actually transactional versus ideological?
I think it's pretty much half and half, to be honest with you. I think there's obviously the transactional side where you've seen Russia becoming more and more dependent on the Chinese as other countries declare Russia to be a pariah following the war in Ukraine, which began in 2022, and it's under sanctions. So it has to find resources from elsewhere. Where can it go? It's going to China. China has never condemned the war in Ukraine, is keeping a neutral stance, and is buying lots of Russian oil. But I think there is also an ideological side to this, which is that Russia and China see themselves as an alternative to the United States and to the West. And what they want to do is to create a new world order, which they dominate, particularly the Chinese, by dividing the West and encouraging Donald Trump, which is what he seems to be doing since the start of his second mandate, to cut ties or certainly downgrade ties with some of his traditional allies within NATO and within Europe. So all of that plays into this role that the two countries see of being dependent on each other. But certainly as things stand at the moment, as far as trade goes, Russia is far more dependent on China than the other way around.
And the Americans have been talking to the Chinese about how to end the war in Iran, and given what you just mentioned there about Ukraine, the question is China's diplomatic clout growing by the day as a result? It's
certainly growing as far as Russia is concerned. You have to look at the amount of imports. 5% of total Russian imports come from Russia. When it's the other way around, looking at the amount of imports going into Russia from China, that is almost over a third of Russian imports come from China. So it's a total imbalance in the amount of imports and exports from each country. Russia needs to export its oil to China. China is buying that oil, and it's seen an increase in the purchase of that oil, but China is saying we're not going to be totally dependent on Russian oil. We're going to look elsewhere for oil supplies, particularly since the start of the war in Iran, not being totally dependent on the Russians. The other aspect, which is interesting to draw attention to here, is what Russia wants is the construction of a new gas pipeline, which is called the Siberia 2 pipeline. It's going to be about 2,600 kilometers long, going through Mongolia and exporting vast amounts of gas from Russia to China, which once again would be good for Russia face to face with the sanctions over the war in Iran. What Russia really needs is money to keep the war effort going, and that money is for a large part coming from China. It's not necessarily a good news for the Russians, because Russia is becoming increasingly dependent on China. So Vladimir Putin is going there to see Xi Jinping. But as I was saying, this relationship, they're putting this aside as putting a face on it as being an equal-based relationship. But in fact, if you look at it, it's a much more strong relationship on the Chinese side than it is on the Russian side.
Now, obviously, people in Paris, London, Washington and other Western capitals will be looking at this trip very, very closely. But how much should the West be worried about this alliance?
I think that there is certainly concern about China's long-term aims for Taiwan, for example, the weak response from Donald Trump in giving his support to Taiwan, the weak response from Donald Trump in the face of Vladimir Putin and not being really much more outspoken in his support for Ukraine, which is giving more emphasis and energy to the Russian effort and also to China's effort. It's true that China is, I think, trying to take advantage of the fact that both Russia and the United States are embroiled in wars right now, two wars that their own making. And that is going to put China in a stronger position because it's not fighting a war right now, so it can build up its resources. And that's also deflecting attention away from China's long-term desire to take over Taiwan. But for the moment, China has other worries. It's trying to work out a solution to the end of the war in Iran because that is undercutting China's oil supplies, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The relationship with the United States, I think, is pretty unbalanced as well due to the fact that Donald Trump went there last week, came away saying it was a fantastic visit, but we don't really know whether they have any trade deals apart from buying soya beans from the Chinese or selling from the United States to the Chinese soya beans and the Chinese buying aeroplanes. We don't know if that contract was actually signed or not. It's very vague what Donald Trump was saying. But I think there is definitely concern about the future relationship between Russia and China, and that's why Russia is coming under so much pressure from the Ukrainians right now, which is, I think, good news for everybody else who wants to see this war over as quickly as possible.